everyone, and welcome back to your online lecture for the week. With this chapter, we're beginning the final unit of the semester, and this week we're going to be focusing on tobacco, one of the most recognizable drugs here in the United States. In terms of use, tobacco is less frequently used than a lot of the other drugs that we see and have covered this semester, and has been recognized as being an incredibly harmful substance to the human body in the long term. But it wasn't always seen this way, and for a while tobacco was thought to be actually medically beneficial to patients. So in today's lecture we're going to be taking a look at tobacco use over the years and what regulations are currently in place to limit tobacco consumption in the United States. So let's go ahead and get started here. So to begin, we know that tobacco comes in a wide range, with tobacco use comes a wide range of side effects. But the most important idea is sort of this thought that tobacco will kill you in the long term. So tobacco-related deaths are very easily preventable, right? You simply just don't smoke or you just don't dip. But still, people are using tobacco products, and years later they end up with a variety of health issues, including heart problems or high blood pressure or cancers such as lung cancer. But despite the prevalence of tobacco use in this country, we know that less people smoke today compared to 50 years ago. So right now we see only about 18% of the United States population currently smoking cigarettes. In 1965, 45% of the U.S. population smoked. So there's sort of this large differential there. This percentage goes up if you take into account the other types of tobacco that people could use. The issue is that even if they're no longer currently smoking, we have a lot of people who have smoked at one point in time and maybe for quite a while. So the carcinogens are still in their body and they're still causing issues years later. Active smokers have gone down in number, but we're still seeing a high death toll every year from previous smoking behaviors. Tobacco use is linked to so many different types of diseases. Smokers can also have weight problems or drinking problems that sometimes go hand in hand, which tobacco can often make worse. So tobacco use is most commonly one of the leading causes of death that we see, but we also see other things that are related to tobacco use that can lead to death as a byproduct of it. So things like ischemic heart disease or coronary artery disease, meaning that your arteries are becoming clogged with fatty deposits. We see that people are developing different types of cancer, including lung cancer as the most prevalent. Strokes and high blood pressure are quite common. Chronic lower respiratory diseases, most commonly known as COPD. And these are the types of diseases that cause airflow blockage and breathing related problems. So this could include things like chronic bronchitis. In some cases, asthma is related. Smoking, although rarer, can also be linked to Alzheimer's, diabetes, influenza, or chronic pneumonia, and nephritis. So we talked about the death toll that sort of comes from tobacco, and we know that it's really tobacco-related deaths kill more people each year than anything else you can throw at a person. Worldwide, we see that tobacco-related deaths are higher than anything else, including AIDS, and we know that HIV/AIDS is one of the world's largest killers. And think about the number of overdoses that are taking place every year and the number of accidents that happen every day. So all of these things that you see on your screen combined still do not overtake the amount of deaths that happen every single year that are tobacco related in nature. That's a lot of people who die yearly from complications relating to tobacco use or secondary smoke issues. This chart that I'm showing you right now shows just how many millions of people die every year from tobacco compared to everything else worldwide. So this is just a little bit different of a perspective than what I showed you on the previous screen. But you'll see that tobacco is responsible for some of the deaths in the respiratory infections category, meaning that fluid is building up in your lungs, and this is linking to things like pneumonia, but without the same sort of types of symptoms, and also in the TB category as well. So this sort of shows that tobacco is having an overreaching influence across the world, yet we still continue to smoke for some reason. So, looking at things from more of a domestic perspective now, we stated earlier in the lecture that only about 18% of Americans actually smoke if you group all of the age, race, and gender categories together. This slide here suggests that 26.5% of Americans use tobacco products, not just smokable tobacco. So there's about an 8.5% differential there between those two groups. So that 8.5 differential is really talking about the smokeless tobacco products, such as those that can be chewed or snuffed. Furthermore, we're still seeing males engage in smoking behaviors and other tobacco uses more frequently than women, which is a pretty frequent trend that we see time and time again over the years. If we look at tobacco from a more historical perspective, tobacco really has had this large role in the formation of our country over the years. It was a huge cash crop that was one of the main reasons why the British actually colonized the Virginia area. And we know that there were huge tobacco plantations in the South, which was very helpful in terms of keeping slavery in industry for so many years, even though it wasn't beneficial on more of a ethical or moral grounds. Economy-wise, it really was successful with the tobacco plantations. We also, if you remember back a few chapters ago when we were talking about alcohol and the triangular trade that was taking place in the Atlantic, tobacco was one of the biggest cash crops that was traded due to the high demand for the product back in different European countries. However, even back in colonial America, there were still some regulations on who could use tobacco. Some states didn't want women to use tobacco, or they didn't want underage or minor individuals to use it. This was especially seen in the South, where women were considered these genteel ladies in their hoop skirts, and they were very, the types of women who needed to be protected, right? They're seen as very ladylike women who we didn't want to have them be engaging in these masculine or considered unladylike behaviors. But these regulations do still carry over today, not in the gender sense, but think about it more in terms of that we don't sell tobacco products to minors, and the big tobacco companies now have to have these regulated warning labels on their products to warn against health effects that tobacco can cause. And that's something that we're going to get to later on in the lecture, but it shows that these regulations are still there for tobacco companies and for the selling of their product. So as tobacco crops became fertile and the tobacco industry really started to take off in colonial America, you just saw a general positive movement for the industry, but you're also seeing some different changes being made in how the industry operated. So for a long while, the most popular type of smoking tobacco was produced for pipes. Gentlemen would have their evening pipe and they would take it and go smoke away from the women, and they would just sit around smoking and talking to one another, maybe having a drink or something like that as well. But then later on, cigars became the newest rage, and suddenly there was less of pipe tobacco being produced and more tobacco being used to produce these high quality cigars. And this demand was especially prevalent among the upper classes. However, the problem with cigars is that obviously they are larger in size. So you need more tobacco in a cigar than you would for a smoking pipe. And if you're producing cigars, then obviously the cost of the product is going to go up because of what you need to create one individual cigar. And most cigars are hand rolled. Good cigars are hand rolled, rather. So again, the cost and the must go up in order for the manufacturer to make a profit. Adversely, what you're seeing is that as the cost of a cigar goes up due to manufacturing costs, it's also now getting out of the reach of the mass consumer, and only a specialized type of individual would be able to purchase a cigar at this time. So you have different consumer groups, normally in the middle and lower classes, who are routinely unable to afford to smoke tobacco due to the high prevalence, or I guess high demand for cigars, right? So that meant that tobacco manufacturers still needed to produce tobacco for hand rolling cigarettes. So there's this gap in the market where most lower class individuals are not buying cigars or pipe tobacco, but they are getting the cheaper tobacco that could be used to hand roll cigarettes. So this is a gap in the market in which the tobacco manufacturers are taking total advantage of later on down the line. And for most people, hand rolling a cigarette does not require the same amount of tobacco like you would see in the picture above. So hand rolling a cigarette is in the picture towards the bottom of the screen, and your cigar is being produced at the top. And you can see that there is a minuscule amount of tobacco in comparison to the cigar, so these are cheaper to produce. However, if you're hand rolling each individual cigarette, that takes time, and that's going to slightly increase the cost that is associated with each type of cigarette. So if you're trying to produce a cheaper alternative to the cigar, then you have to figure out a way to mass produce cigarettes, and you have to do so quickly. So very quickly after that, we have this invention of the cigarette rolling machine. The cigarette rolling machine replaces the cigarette girls who were hand rolling all of the individual cigarettes. So if you're able to mass produce cigarettes rather than hand rolling them, you're cutting the cost way down, and you're able to mass produce cigarettes at a very cheap rate, fraction of the cost really. And modern cigarette machines, not the ones that are early on, but more modern ones, can roll about 3,600 cigarettes a minute, which brings, in theory, the cost of cigarettes way down. There's one section of the country in which tobacco grows the best. In the deep Atlantic South, Nicotina tabacum grows so well due to the type of soil that is found there. Most of our tobacco crops are actually grown in North Carolina, and that's where you see the majority of flue-cured tobacco, coming from. In order to flue-cure tobacco, what do you think you need? Where do you see flues most commonly at? They're in chimneys. So when you cure tobacco, you're trying to eliminate the chlorophyll content from the leaves. You want to dry them out, and you need a heat source, and you need that heat source to rise. The smoking needs to rise. So most often you're going to flue cure tobacco in a tobacco barn. So you're trying to dry them out, and once that smoke gets into the tobacco leaves, you want to hang them so that they'll sort of dry out even further, and you get the flavor of the smoke in sort of tucked into the tobacco leaves themselves. So it's a long process. And if you look here, this is a secondary look at some tobacco leaves that have already been smoked, and they lower them down into the lower parts of the barn because heat rises, smoke rises. So once they've been cured, lower them down to the lower part of the barn, where you hang them for about a week. Then you shred all the tobacco up, and then you put it in a big tobacco silo where it can sort of dry out even more, and the tobacco will stay in that silo for about a year. So like I said, it's a pretty long process from start to finish before it's ready to be smoked. And remember that once the cigarette rolling machine was created, cigarettes were able to be mass produced for pennies on the dollar. And it was rarer that cigars or pipe tobacco were being used. The mass consumer was smoking cigarettes. Cigarettes ruled, and they ruled with a vengeance during this time. And everybody was smoking. Young, old, everybody was. Male, female, no matter who was smoking, no one was really taking into account or were really concerned about the health effects that were associated with cigarettes for a very long time. And for a while, they were even recommended by doctors as a form of medical treatment. Think back to our patent medicine discussion earlier in the semester and how cigarettes were actually recommended to treat asthma. And in the short term, it actually does work. It does help treat asthma, but it's not really a good recommendation for someone who can't breathe. However, in the very short term, the smoke from the cigarette actually opens up your bronchial airways, and it helps you ease your breathing. However, in the long term, inhaling anything that is smoke related isn't good for your lungs, and it is not recommended for somebody who has asthma. There are other medications that can open up your bronchial airways the same way, and then you don't have to ingest that smoke. So in 1964, you see the United States government, the main part of government regulation coming into play, and the Surgeon General's office coming out and saying that cigarettes may be related to cancer, lung cancer. Well, that is a pretty good link that has been proven over the years, but one that big tobacco was not necessarily willing to get behind, because you can imagine from a business perspective, this is not a good link that you want reported about your company. In 1964, that Surgeon General's warning was not the first time that the government made the recommendation about lung cancer and cigarette smoking. However, it is the one that seems to stick, and it is the most popular that we know today. As part of that recommendation, the government also mandates that cigarette companies have to put warning labels on their packs and cartons, and by 1970, it's mandatory for them to do so to warn the consumer about the dangers associated with cigarette smoking. The labels that are on cigarettes really come from the idea that we need to regulate cigarette smoking and advertising measures from big tobacco, because if they had it their way, they would not advertise cigarettes as something that is being harmful. However, for years, that's the way that they did it. And the warnings that the government have mandated make the government happy and make the consumer more informed, but do not necessarily make big tobacco happy. So after this requirement comes out, you see a slight dip in cigarette sales, but they rebound quite quickly after that when big tobacco takes extra steps to appease the customer. And how do you think they do it? They do it with creative advertising. So for the next couple of decades, big tobacco steps up their game big time. They advertise, they endorse, they give away free things when you send in your UPC codes from your cigarette packs and cartons. They're doing it all. But as big tobacco gets bigger, people are getting sicker. And that's when these patients, they start to sue, and attorney generals do it on their behalf. Attorney generals from 46 states sue big tobacco. And they do so in 1998. I should put that out there, give you the year. 1998, in which these attorney generals sue big tobacco. And big tobacco is considered the largest four tobacco companies that were running at that time. So Philip Morris, R.J. Reynolds, Brown and Williamson, and Lorillard companies comprise big tobacco. And Philip Morris obviously is the biggest of the four. The states that are suing these four companies, or big tobacco, are suing over the Medicaid costs that are used by the states to cover the health care costs associated with tobacco-related illnesses. And as part of those settlements, big tobacco agrees to pay out over $200 million and would also be limited on the behaviors that they are allowed to engage in regards to advertising their products. So if you account for inflation between 1998, the year of the settlement, and today, that settlement would be worth more than $300 million by today's standards. So, in addition to the payout, what was big tobacco not able to do anymore? Well, they have limitations on advertising. This means that there are no more TV commercials advertising cigarettes, and there is limited space for magazine ads. But within those magazine ads, big tobacco is restricted on what can be shown within the advertisement. So, for example, they are banned from showing cartoon characters in advertising. For a long while, one of the most popular characters that advertised cigarettes besides the Marlboro Man was Joe Camel. And this was something that was supposed to appeal to younger demographics and became very quickly one of the biggest advertising gimmicks that was out there. He was literally a smoking camel who smoked Camel cigarettes, and the character was supposed to sort of be this play on Joe Cool, who was the ulterior version of Snoopy, if you remember back to your Peanut days. But for some reason, advertisers also jumped on the Flintstones, and for a while they were a large part of TV advertising for Flintstones, and later Tom and Jerry too. So no more cartoons across the board. There is also going to be this ban on branded advertisement. for merchandise in terms of selling that stuff or giving that type of things away for free. So this meant that you could no longer send in your UPC codes and redeem them for merchandise. There used to be a system with a bunch of different brands, but largely Marlboro was the one who was the most famous for doing so, in which if you sent in this many UPC codes, then you were eligible to get this type of product for free. And they had a catalog of items, and one UPC code from a pack got you this many miles, and then one UPC code would get you so many miles, a pack would get you so many miles as well, and they had this whole catalog of items that you could pick from. I think even at one time there was a video game system, I think it was an Atari, that you could buy or you could redeem for value. So all of that is gone. And Big Tobacco is also limited in terms of the sponsorships that they're allowed to purchase for sporting events, and that's why you don't see any tobacco company sponsorships for teams or organizations. And if you just take the NFL, for example, if you think about the number of endorsements that the NFL has, you have an official everything. Tide, the official detergent of the NFL. Bud Light, the official beer of the NFL. Papa John's, the official pizza of the NFL. There is an official everything. Everything can be bought from the NFL, and you can have a commercial to go with it. But if you think about it, there is no official cigarette of the NFL, and that is due to this master settlement. Tobacco companies also have to disband the tobacco trade organizations that are currently in place, and they have to designate specific funds to support anti-smoking measures and research to reduce youth smoking. So this means educational programs, awareness campaigns, funding for scientific research, and they're going to have to limit the amount of advertising that kids are able to see. So no more public billboards, no more wrapping of buses, nothing out there in the public eye. And that is something that is very hard for a company who is trying to advertise their product to do. So here's a look at the Marlboro catalog that I mentioned before. So I was trying to explain it a little bit earlier, but let me go back and sort of explain it more clearly. So Marlboro would call their UPC codes Marlboro miles. And a pack was worth so many miles, and a carton was worth so many miles, and more so, it was worth more than an individual pack would be. So once you got to a certain point, you would be able to redeem these miles for clothing or camping gear that you see here, and everything very conveniently came with the Marlboro logo on it. But back in the 1990s, when it was at the peak, they had Marlboro everything. They had lunch boxes and coolers and water jugs and all sorts of other things with this logo stamped across them. And kind of a weird, fun side note, I had an uncle that for the longest time, Marlboro Reds were his cigarette of choice, and he smoked so often and had so many of these UPC codes that he was getting free stuff all the time, to the point where he would give it away to all his family members. So I remember that my very first school lunchbox when I went to kindergarten was this red and white Marlboro mini cooler, and I still remember it. I think my parents have it somewhere scattered among all their belongings somewhere, but that lunchbox was damn near indestructible. Like, I used that thing for years, and it was a pretty good sized cooler. Like, it held a lot of lunch, and that's always a good thing when we're trying to barter for better things to eat at the lunch table. So that lunchbox did me well for a good number of years, but at the expense of my uncle's lungs, obviously, with all of the UPC codes he would need to redeem to get something like that. All right. So moving on, like always, you know me by now, my classes would not be complete without some kind of commentary from John Oliver. You know how much I love to include him in my classes, and he just so happens to have a segment on the tobacco industry. And you can find that clip on the class website. I encourage you all to watch it, but remember, it is HBO, so the standard warnings come along with it. It's about 18 minutes long, and in this clip, John Oliver really dissects what other countries are doing in terms of their cigarette warning labels, how Big Tobacco is trying to combat that because the regulations in other countries are not the same as they are here in the US. And so they're trying to sue the countries who are using these labels, and in some cases they're actually winning. He also talks about the advertising restrictions that are here in the United States, and he actually comes up with a much better alternative to Joe the camel. He comes up with Jeff the diseased lung. So I hope you enjoy the commentary, and we'll talk about it at some point. All right, so when you smoke a cigarette, let's talk about what your body is actually getting. Your body doesn't necessarily care as much about the tobacco as it does the nicotine. When you smoke tobacco, there is a rapid transference of nicotine to the brain. You will start to feel the effects of nicotine in about 10 seconds from inhaling a puff on a cigarette. The nicotine enters the bloodstream through the lungs, through the lung membranes, and starts to have an effect on your body almost immediately. Nicotine is a stimulant. So that means that there's going to be a slight rush associated with the drug. Nicotine does not depress your CNS system, your central nervous system. Remember, we keep talking about that. But rather, the effects of nicotine are slightly similar to how your body would react to cocaine. However, on a much, 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 much smaller scale. So when we're talking about these stimulant effects from nicotine, what is happening to the body? Since nicotine is a stimulant, you're going to experience that little rush of euphoria. You're going to experience things like an increase in your rate of respiration, and there's also going to be an increase in your heart rate and your blood pressure. This means that your heart will need more oxygen, so you're going to have to breathe more frequently and deeper than you would without using the nicotine. So you can see how this would help an asthmatic in the short term, like we talked about before. But this all depends on the way that the tobacco is used and the type of tobacco that is used. So it will depend on the exact composition of the tobacco, what is mixed in with the tobacco. Taking a pinch of tobacco is about the same as smoking 3 to 4 cigarettes. But smoking tobacco exposes the users to a bunch of other things, including carbon monoxide, carbon dioxide, nitrogen oxides, ammonia, volatile nitrosamines, hydrogen cyanide, volatile sulfur-containing compounds, volatile hydrocarbons, alcohols, aldehydes, and ketones. And finally, the amount of nicotine that is found in tobacco is going to range somewhere between 0.2 to 5% depending on the tobacco that you get. So there are a ton of different variables that are included here when you're smoking. The nicotine effects are also dependent on how densely packed the tobacco is. If the tobacco is more densely packed, you're going to get less airflow through the tobacco and you're going to get more heat. If you pack it tightly, then there's not a hot smoke and you're not going to burn yourself with this hot smoke. It can also be difficult if the tobacco that is being lit is packed too lightly, because then you get a stronger heat. Some cigarettes have a filter, whereas others do not. Hand-rolled cigarettes most often do not have a filter, but commercially packed cigarettes, on the flip side, commonly do have one, but it's not mandatory for tobacco companies to do so. Cigarettes never used to be filtered, and the majority of cigars produced today are not filtered now. Look at this picture in the lower right-hand corner of the screen. There is a white filter and a brown filter. Obviously, the cigarette on the right has already been smoked. You can see the ash that's at the top of the cigarette. Look at the filter. The one on the left is white, the one on the right is brown. It originated in white. After you smoke it, it turns brown. What is happening here is that the filter is trying to sort of filter out all of the carcinogens that are coming from the tobacco, but obviously that doesn't work. So we're trying to catch all of that nastiness that I mentioned before that comes along with smoking, but clearly it's not working if all these people are still getting as sick as they are. So filter or no filter, it doesn't really make that much of an effect. The volume of smoke that is inhaled also has an effect. Most people inhale cigarette smoke, but they do not inhale the smoke from a cigar. Why? Well, there's normally too much nicotine in a cigar, and that will make you sick. Plus, the chemicals they put in cigarettes help the cigarette burn at a lower heat than cigars do. Cigars burn too hot, and you will burn your lungs with that heat if you're chronically inhaling it. So most people do not inhale the smoke that comes from a cigar. Finally, the number of cigarettes that you smoke has a large impact as well. Cigarettes are on average lit for about 5 minutes, and from one individual cigarette you can maybe get about 10 puffs for that cigarette. Most smokers smoke about a pack a day or less, sometimes more, but there's generally 20 cigarettes in one pack, so that equates to roughly 200 puffs a day. And that seems like an awful lot of tobacco and nicotine if you ask me. To combat the stench of tobacco and the effects of the substance, e-cigarettes or vaping have been developed and really have taken off in the last handful of years. There's this new big trend that we're seeing take place. But what's interesting is that in a pinch, you can use an e-cigarette to smoke marijuana. It's obviously not what they were developed for, but they have the capability of doing so. But with an e-cigarette, there's no physical tobacco like there is with a regular cigarette. Instead, what you have is this liquid cartridge that releases the nicotine to the smoker. The smell is a lot better depending on the scent that you use or the flavor that you use, and supposedly it has less of an effect in terms of secondhand smoke, but there has not been any completed formal evaluations of these devices and the nicotine in terms of secondhand smoke distribution. If you remember, there were in the news a couple years ago, there were quite a few stories out there in which e-cigarettes were exploding and catching fire. So on that end, they're not always very safe. But you can imagine that if you're smoking something and that smoke enters your lungs, then it's not safe or recommended, right? It's a foreign substance in your body, probably not something you want to be doing. But we'll see once the FDA completes their formal evaluation if there is a significant lessening of the detrimental effects compared to traditional cigarette smoking. The one benefit of e-cigarettes is the variety of flavors that are out there. Some are more sweet than others, and some are even pleasant to smell, but you can get them in the more traditional tobacco flavors if you miss that traditional cigarette. You can get them in Marlboro flavored. There's one with menthol, different types depending on the brand. But if the goal is to make it a more pleasant environment for everyone involved, I personally would prefer it if you smoked some of the sweeter ones, but to each their own. As we know, tobacco has been a permanent staple in American culture since the advent of our country. As tobacco use keeps decreasing in frequency, the cost of a pack of cigarettes is going to keep increasing in price and value. Long gone are the days in which tobacco use was seen as sophisticated and cool, and now it is simply associated with high cost, disease, and in some cases, an early death. A illicit and legal drug, tobacco has its place in American society, but it is quickly dwindling, and we are seeing fewer and fewer people smoke every year. Big tobacco is trying their best to hold on, but it becomes tougher and tougher for them as we move along here. So thank you for joining me for this lecture on tobacco, and join me next time as we tackle hallucinogenic drugs. I'll see you then, and have a good one, everybody.